The first time most people saw the name Nick Reiner that week, it was not in a headline about a movie, a script credit, or a recovery story. It was in the kind of sentence that makes your stomach drop before your mind can even process it. The son of filmmaker Rob Reiner and photographer-producer Michelle Singer Reiner, arrested and charged in their deaths. News organizations described prosecutors filing 2 counts of first-degree murder. The couple found dead at their Brentwood home, and the case instantly detonated across Hollywood and far beyond it, because the Reiners were not tabloid strangers. They were a familiar kind of American public family. Successful, politically connected, photographed at premieres, the sort of people whose smiling pictures make you assume safety is built into the walls. That is why the internet did what it always does when reality feels impossible. It went hunting backward, scrolling for evidence that the ending had been written earlier. And that is how those old clips came roaring back, not as casual content anymore, but as artifacts like someone dug up home video from a house fire and started studying the smoke patterns. A TV segment fixated on a family photo where everyone looked normal except Nick, who seemed stiff and hollow, his face caught in an expression that people online interpreted as frightening, not because it was monstrous, but because it was unreadable. From there, the pipeline of unease widened. A 2016 behind-the-scenes style video surfaced where Nick, filmed in a documentary tone, wandered through calm, expensive streets and said a line that now plays like a warning siren in people's heads. Sometimes I just come out to gather my sick thoughts. In isolation, it could have been awkward humor, a performative bit, or a young man trying to sound provocative. In context, after the charges, it landed differently, like a confession delivered years early to an audience that did not yet know to be afraid. Viewers replayed his eyes, the flatness, the calm, the way he refused even to say his own name at one point, pushing back with a defensive arrogance that sounded less like confidence than paranoia. Then there were the other moments, the ones that made the comment sections turn to ice. Clips from interviews around the film being Charlie showed a father trying to reach across a gap with gentleness while his son answered in short, mechanical sentences, rarely making eye contact, his body rigid, as if emotion itself were painful. People magazine previously reported Nick saying he had been through rehab at least 18 times, describing years of addiction and periods of homelessness, details that were already heavy long before any crime story existed, and that now fed a grim new narrative online. That this was not a sudden break, but a long leak nobody could seal. The public began stitching together a portrait from fragments. A young man with a history of instability and shame, a famous father who believed structure might save him, a mother who hovered with exhausted hope, and a family whose private struggle had been partially documented on camera, leaving behind footage that could be reread like a diary after the fact. But the clip that truly terrified people was not the old interviews. It was the surveillance-style footage described in broadcasts. Nick inside a gas station after the killings, moving through aisles like any other customer, buying a drink, waiting in line, behaving quietly, politely, normally. Normal is what the brain uses as a safety signal, and that is why it became so disturbing. If someone looks frantic, the mind can file them under danger and move on. But if someone looks composed, the mind starts to panic in a different way because it cannot find the boundary between everyday life and catastrophe. Reports said officers converged and arrested him without drama, and viewers watched that calmness like it was the scariest special effect they had ever seen because it suggested a person already detached from consequences, already living somewhere far behind the eyes. The court appearance added one more layer to the nightmare. Cameras capturing him behind a barrier, wearing an anti-suicide vest, shackled, barely blinking, speaking only briefly, while his attorney urged caution and the public tried to force a coherent explanation onto something still unfolding. Officials and prosecutors, meanwhile, emphasized complexity and investigation, and major outlets noted that the legal process was ongoing, with key questions still unanswered, including motive. In the middle of all that uncertainty, the internet kept returning to the same uncomfortable thought. What if the clearest warning signs are not explosions, but absences, the missing warmth, the missing reaction, the missing sense of being present in your own life. What if the scariest moment is not the crime itself, but the years before it, when everyone is still smiling for the camera and you do not yet know which face is already gone? Part high begins where the internet's fear quietly deepened, not with violence, but with reinterpretation. Once the initial shock faded, people stopped asking what happened and started asking how long it had been happening. Old footage of Nick Reiner was no longer watched casually. It was dissected frame by frame, tone by tone, pause by pause, as if meaning might finally reveal itself if viewers stared long enough. This is where the story shifted from true crime to something more unsettling. A collective realization that the warning signs were not loud, chaotic, or cinematic. They were quiet, repetitive, and emotionally vacant. In psychology, emptiness is harder to recognize than anger, and far easier to excuse. When Nick spoke about addiction, homelessness, and rehab, his words carried none of the tremor people expect from pain. He described sleeping outside in different states, as if listing addresses from a past life that no longer belonged to him. That lack of emotional resonance is what made viewers uneasy in hindsight. It sounded less like resilience and more like dissociation, the mind's way of stepping away when feeling becomes unbearable. At the time, many interpreted it as maturity, recovery, or even dark humor. After the arrests, it felt like something else entirely, like listening to someone narrate their own disappearance. Interviews from 2016, especially those promoting being Charlie, suddenly took on a grim double meaning. The film itself was framed as a story of recovery, a father and son turning personal struggle into art, but reality never followed the script audiences were sold. Sitting beside his father, Nick answered questions with clip precision, rarely expanding, rarely reacting. When asked about working together, he said it was a fairly pleasant experience, repeating the phrase more than once as if stuck in a loop. Repetition is often a sign of anxiety or emotional shutdown, but on camera it was read as awkwardness, shyness, or a personality quirk. Meanwhile, Rob Reiner leaned toward him, eyes soft, voice careful, trying to inject warmth into a conversation that kept sliding back into silence. The contrast was painful even before tragedy reframed it. A father speaking in the language of connection, a son replying in the language of survival. What made the internet truly spiral, though, was the realization that none of this was hidden. These moments were public. They aired on talk shows, press junkets, and online platforms. Millions could see the stiffness, the flat effect, the emotional distance. Yet, without a dramatic outburst or visible breakdown, there was nothing for the collective conscience to latch onto. People are trained to recognize danger when it is loud. They are far less equipped to recognize it when it arrives as calm. That is why one particular clip resurfaced obsessively: Nick's reaction to a dog on set. His voice did not rise. His face did not change. He said he would hurt the dog with a tone so empty it barely registered as threat at the time. Afterward, mental health professionals online pointed out that the absence of emotion can be more alarming than rage, especially when paired with violent ideation. But those explanations came after the fact, when guilt had already seeped into the viewing experience. The internet was no longer watching to understand him. It was watching to understand itself. How did so many people see this and move on? Another layer of unease emerged with stories about medication changes and diagnoses that later surfaced in reporting. Discussions about schizophrenia, psychiatric treatment, and altered prescriptions fueled a different kind of fear, not of monsters, but of systems failing quietly. Commentators debated whether medical adjustments could destabilize someone already fragile, whether warning signs were misread as progress, whether compliance was mistaken for healing. None of those questions had clean answers, and that uncertainty only amplified the dread. The courtroom footage added to the sense of something fundamentally wrong. Nick appeared restrained, silent, barely responsive, wearing an anti-suicide vest, his eyes fixed forward. When he spoke, it was only to say, "Yes, Your Honor," 3 words stripped of inflection. Viewers described it as watching a person already absent from the room, as if the legal process were happening around him rather than to him. Again, it was not chaos that disturbed people. It was the vacuum. Silence has a way of forcing the imagination to work overtime, and the internet filled that silence with theories, diagnoses, blame, and regret. Some blamed Hollywood pressure. Others blamed parenting styles, rehab culture, or media exploitation. Many blamed no one and instead focused on a harder truth: that love, resources, and intention do not guarantee safety when someone is unraveling from the inside. Stories from family friends painted a haunting picture of the days before everything collapsed. Dinners, laughter, routine conversations, a household that looked, from the outside, like it was stabilizing. That narrative is perhaps the most terrifying of all, because it contradicts the idea that crisis always announces itself. Sometimes, stability is not recovery. Sometimes it is surrender. The more people read and watched, the clearer the pattern became. Nick did not explode. He faded. He withdrew emotionally long before anything illegal occurred, and because withdrawal is socially quieter than aggression, it passed without alarms. In that sense, the 7 haunting videos terrified the internet not because they revealed a villain in disguise, but because they exposed how easily emptiness can be mistaken for calm. They forced viewers to confront an uncomfortable possibility: that the most dangerous warning signs are not always the ones that scare us in a moment, but the ones that feel almost normal until it is too late. Part BA moves away from the clips themselves and into the deeper psychological tension that made this story lodge itself so firmly in the public consciousness. What unsettled people was not just what Nick Reiner did or what he said, but the emotional pattern that stretched across years and never seemed to resolve. Watching the footage in sequence feels less like witnessing a descent and more like watching someone slowly disconnect from the idea that they are an active participant in their own life. That is why so many viewers describe the experience as haunting rather than shocking. Shock fades. Haunting stays. In multiple interviews, Nick spoke about addiction, rehab, and homelessness with a tone that felt almost administrative, as if he were listing completed tasks rather than lived experiences. He did not frame drugs as escape or rebellion, but as a way to quiet what he called the noise in his head. That phrasing matters. Noise implies constant internal pressure, something relentless and exhausting. And when people live under that kind of mental strain for long enough, emotional numbness can begin to feel like relief. In that light, the flatness that viewers later found so disturbing may have been a coping mechanism that calcified over time. The tragedy is that emotional shutdown can look, from the outside, like improvement. Fewer outbursts, fewer conflicts, fewer visible crises. Families, doctors, and even the individuals themselves can mistake the absence of chaos for stability. This is where the story becomes especially painful, because it reveals how easily well-intentioned help can slide into misunderstanding. Nick's repeated stays in rehab, reportedly as many as 18, were framed publicly as evidence that his family never gave up. And that may be true. But in his own words, rehab also became something that happened to him rather than something he chose, a system of control that reinforced the belief that he was broken and needed constant fixing. Over time, that dynamic can erode a person's sense of agency. When someone begins to feel like their life is managed rather than lived, detachment can follow. Interviews from 2016 show subtle signs of this erosion. Nick often spoke as if his past belonged to someone else. When he said he'd slept outside in Maine, New Jersey, or Texas, there was no pause for emotion, no space for vulnerability. Pain was compressed into facts. This compression is a common survival response, but it comes at a cost. When emotion is consistently suppressed, it does not disappear. It relocates, often emerging in distorted thoughts, dark humor, or an eerie calm that masks inner chaos. This is why so many mental health professionals later emphasize that the most alarming aspect of the footage was not anger, but emptiness. Rage can be addressed, redirected, treated. Emptiness is harder to reach because it does not announce itself as a problem. The relationship between Nick and his father added another layer to this emotional standoff. On camera, Rob Reiner appeared as a man desperate to bridge a gap he could feel but not cross. He spoke openly about mistakes, about trusting experts over instinct, about wishing he had listened more. His words carried regret and humility, and to viewers they sounded like the right words, spoken too late. Nick's response to those admissions was not anger or blame, but stillness. He did not argue. He did not comfort. He simply absorbed the moment and moved on, as if the emotional exchange itself were too heavy to hold. That imbalance haunted audiences because it mirrored a fear many people have about their own families. The idea that love, even sincere and sustained love, might fail to reach someone who is already retreating inward. The gas station footage became symbolic of that retreat. Here was a man who had allegedly committed an unthinkable act, yet he moved through a brightly lit public space with the ease of routine. He waited in line. He paid. He complied. To the human brain, this creates cognitive dissonance. We expect guilt, panic, or at least visible distress. When none appears, the mind searches for explanation and often lands on the most frightening conclusion: that something essential has switched off. That perception followed Nick into the courtroom. Wearing restraints and an anti-suicide vest, he sat silently, his face nearly expressionless, responding only when prompted. When he said yes, Your Honor, it sounded less like acknowledgement and more like compliance with a script. Observers described the scene as watching someone already removed from the emotional consequences of their actions. Whether that interpretation is fair or not is a question for clinicians and courts, but the visual impact was undeniable. Silence became the dominant language of the case. Silence in interviews. Silence in court. Silence in the days leading up to the tragedy, according to family friends who described peaceful dinners and quiet conversations. One friend later said that what frightened him most in hindsight was not conflict, but how normal everything seemed. That statement cut deeply because it challenges a comforting myth that danger always looks like danger. In reality, collapse can be quiet. It can wear the mask of calm. It can arrive after laughter, routine, and apparent reconciliation. The internet's fixation on these videos, then, was not driven purely by morbid curiosity. It was driven by recognition. Viewers saw pieces of people they knew, or parts of themselves, in the emotional withdrawal, the polite answers, the dark jokes that deflected pain. The fear came from realizing how easily such signs can be dismissed until hindsight transforms them into warnings. In that sense, the 7 haunting videos did more than document a single tragic case. They exposed a collective blind spot. They showed how modern audiences, trained by entertainment to expect dramatic arcs and explosive breakdowns, can overlook the slow, silent unraveling that happens in real life. And that realization lingered long after the clips stopped playing, leaving behind a question with no easy answer. How many times have we mistaken stillness for safety, and how many stories have already begun to fade quietly, right in front of us? Part Bond shifts the focus from the individual psychology to the environment that surrounded it, because this story cannot be understood by isolating one person from the systems, expectations, and pressures that shaped him. What unsettled many observers was not only Nick's internal collapse, but how smoothly it unfolded inside a world that outwardly appeared supportive, wealthy, and informed. In public imagination, resources are often treated as protection. Money, access to top doctors, private rehab centers, and influential networks are assumed to form a safety net strong enough to catch anyone before they fall too far. The Reiner story quietly dismantled that assumption. Despite every advantage, the underlying crisis progressed, not in chaos, but in order. Appointments were kept. Programs were attended. Interviews were given. On paper, it looked like intervention after intervention was working. Yet the emotional core remained untouched. Nick's own words suggested that each attempt to help, however loving, reinforced the idea that he was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be trusted. That distinction matters. When help becomes constant supervision, it can unintentionally communicate that failure is expected and autonomy is dangerous. Over time, this can hollow out motivation and identity, leaving compliance in place of connection. Friends later described how, in the final weeks, the household felt calm, almost serene. Meals were shared. Conversations stayed light. There were no visible arguments or crises. To an outsider, it might have looked like a turning point. But calm can mean many things. In clinical contexts, sudden emotional quiet after prolonged struggle is sometimes a warning sign, not of recovery, but of resignation. When someone stops fighting, stops asking, stops reacting, it can signal that they have withdrawn hope rather than found peace. This interpretation casts the resurfaced videos in a darker light. The flat effect, the short answers, the lack of visible emotion were not new developments after the tragedy. They were patterns. Patterns that blended seamlessly into polite social norms, especially in environments where restraint and composure are valued. Hollywood, in particular, rewards people who can perform normalcy under pressure. It teaches emotional regulation as professionalism. In that context, Nick's detachment may have been misread as maturity, recovery, or even strength. The industry's language of redemption also played a role. Being Charlie was marketed as a story of healing, a creative collaboration between father and son that transformed pain into art. That narrative made it harder to question the underlying reality. Audiences want arcs. They want before and after. They want the idea that struggle leads somewhere meaningful. But life does not always follow narrative logic. Sometimes it circles the same unresolved pain until exhaustion replaces resistance. The media response after the arrest revealed another layer of discomfort. Coverage oscillated between shock and analysis, with commentators searching for a singular cause: mental illness, addiction, medication changes, family dynamics, fame. Each explanation offered partial clarity, but no resolution. This fragmentation mirrored the way the crisis itself unfolded, spread across years and systems rather than contained in a single moment. Mental health professionals emphasize that schizophrenia and other severe disorders can distort perception, erode emotional expression, and complicate treatment, especially when combined with substance abuse. But even these explanations came with caution. Diagnosis does not equal destiny. Treatment does not equal cure. And stability, especially when defined only by external behavior, does not guarantee safety. The courtroom proceedings reinforced this ambiguity. Nick's silence was interpreted in radically different ways depending on the viewer. Some saw composure. Others saw emptiness. Some saw medication at work. Others saw dissociation. The legal system, bound by procedure, moved carefully, emphasizing evaluation and due process. Public discourse, by contrast, filled the gaps with speculation. Yet beneath the noise was a quieter realization spreading through comment sections and long-form discussions, that this story was less about blame and more about limits. The limits of parental control. The limits of medical intervention. The limits of narrative frameworks that promise resolution. Even the concept of love was reframed. Love was present everywhere in the accounts that followed, spoken of by friends, family, and colleagues. But love alone proved insufficient. That is a difficult truth to accept, especially in cultures that equate care with outcome. The idea that you can do everything right and still lose someone destabilizes deeply held beliefs about responsibility and fairness. It also explains why the videos continued to circulate long after the initial shock faded. They were not just evidence. They were mirrors. People watched them searching for certainty, for a moment they could point to and say, "This is where it went wrong." But the footage refused to offer that clarity. There was no single turning point, no dramatic warning that could have changed everything if noticed in time. Instead, there was accumulation. Small distances. Repeated silences. a gradual retreat from emotional presence that looked, on the surface, like calm cooperation. In that sense, the haunting power of these videos lies not in what they show, but in what they deny. They deny the comfort of a simple explanation. They deny the fantasy that danger is always obvious. They deny the belief that care and resources can always outpace illness. What remains is an unsettling lesson that some crises unfold not as storms, but as slow fades, and that recognizing the difference between peace and surrender may be one of the hardest and most necessary skills any family or society can learn. Part Nam confronts the uncomfortable aftermath, not just of the tragedy itself, but of the way the public responds when a story like this refuses to settle into a clean moral frame. In the weeks following the arrests, the narrative fractured into parallel conversations that rarely touched each other. One focused on legal accountability, timelines, and charges. Another spiraled into amateur psychological analysis, replaying interviews and home videos as if meaning could be extracted through sheer repetition. A third turned inward, quieter and more unsettling, as people began reflecting on their own relationships, wondering which silences in their lives might be carrying more weight than they realized. What made the Nick Reiner story linger was that none of these conversations felt complete on their own. The legal process, by design, strips emotion away in favor of facts and procedure. The psychological commentary offered insight, but no certainty. And the personal reflections opened questions that could not be easily answered. Together, they formed a kind of collective unease, a sense that this was not a story to be solved, but one to be lived with. Online discussions repeatedly returned to the idea of warning signs. People asked whether the jokes about violence, the flat effect, the emotional distance, or the repeated rehab stays should have triggered stronger intervention. But embedded in those questions was a deeper fear that even if the signs were recognized, the outcome might not have changed. This fear challenges a fundamental human instinct, the belief that awareness guarantees prevention. In reality, awareness often arrives without power. Families can see suffering clearly and still be unable to reach it. Professionals can diagnose accurately and still struggle to treat effectively. Communities can care deeply and still fall short. The Reiner case forced many to confront that gap between recognition and control. Another theme that surfaced was guilt, not only among those close to the family, but among viewers themselves. Comment sections filled with people admitting they had seen similar behaviors in friends, siblings, or partners and dismissed them as phases, personality traits, or dark humor. The resurfaced videos became a kind of moral mirror, reflecting moments when empathy might have been delayed or discomfort ignored. Yet this guilt was complicated by the realization that constant vigilance is impossible. Not every withdrawn person is in danger. Not every dark joke signals collapse. The challenge lies in discerning when patterns become trajectories, and that line is rarely clear in real time. Media coverage also played a role in shaping the emotional fallout. Some outlets leaned into sensationalism, framing the story as a shocking Hollywood downfall. Others adopted a somber tone, emphasizing mental health and systemic failure. The contrast highlighted a tension in how society consumes tragedy. There's a pull toward spectacle, toward narratives that provoke fear or outrage, but there is also a quieter hunger for understanding, for context that does not exploit pain. The enduring attention to these videos suggests that many viewers were seeking the latter. They were not just watching to be scared. They were watching to make sense of vulnerability, to understand how suffering can hide behind politeness, routine, and apparent calm. In this way, the videos functioned almost like a case study, though an incomplete one. They showed what emotional withdrawal looks like in public spaces, how easily it blends into social norms, and how rarely it provokes immediate alarm. They also exposed the limitations of retrospective clarity. Once an outcome is known, every past moment seems charged with meaning. But before that knowledge, those same moments often appear ordinary. This is one of the most painful truths the story reveals. Hindsight creates patterns that foresight cannot always see. Friends of the family later spoke about the final days as peaceful, even hopeful. That detail haunted many people because it contradicts the expectation that crisis escalates visibly. Instead, it suggests that resolution, or something resembling it, may sometimes precede catastrophe. Psychologists have noted that when someone feels they have exhausted all options, their distress can quiet. The mind stops signaling urgency because it no longer believes change is possible. To observers, this can look like acceptance or recovery. In reality, it may be surrender. This reframing shifts the meaning of the videos yet again. The calm demeanor, the short answers, the absence of visible emotion may not have been signs of control returning, but signs of connection fading. This interpretation is deeply unsettling because it implies that some of the behaviors society praises, composure, politeness, emotional restraint, can also mask profound danger. It asks viewers to reconsider how they interpret calm, especially in people with long histories of struggle. The broader cultural impact of the story lies here. It challenges the idea that mental health crises always announce themselves through disruption. Sometimes they manifest through compliance, silence, and withdrawal. Sometimes the person most in need of help is the one causing the least trouble. That insight resonated strongly online, where many people shared experiences of loved ones who seemed fine until they were not. The comments shifted from speculation to solidarity, from asking what went wrong to asking how to listen better. Yet even that impulse was tempered by humility. Listening does not guarantee rescue. Presence does not guarantee recovery. Love does not guarantee safety. These acknowledgments are heavy, but they may be the most honest legacy of the story. Part Nam, then, is not about answers, but about reckoning. It is about sitting with the discomfort of not knowing where intervention ends and helplessness begins. It is about recognizing that some tragedies do not offer lessons that can be neatly applied, only questions that must be held with care. And it is about understanding why those 7 haunting videos continued to circulate, not because they explained the unexplainable, but because they reminded people how fragile the line is between ordinary life and irreversible loss, and how easily that line can be crossed without anyone hearing a sound. Part Sao turns toward what remains after the analysis, after the headlines, and after the endless replaying of footage finally slows. When the shock recedes, what is left is not clarity, but a quiet, persistent question about responsibility and limits. Many people watching this story felt an instinctive urge to assign fault, to identify a decision, a moment, or a failure that could explain everything. But as time passed, that impulse softened into something heavier and harder to resolve. The recognition that not all tragedies are the result of a single wrong turn. Some are the product of long, uneven battles where effort and outcome drift further apart with each passing year. The Nick Reiner case unsettled audiences because it resisted the comfort of blame. His parents loved him. Professionals intervened. Resources were abundant. And still, the crisis unfolded. That reality forces a confrontation with an idea many people avoid, that there are limits to what care, structure, and expertise can accomplish when someone is fighting an internal war that never truly quiets. Mental illness, especially when severe and compounded by addiction, does not move in straight lines. Progress can coexist with deterioration. Calm can sit beside chaos. From the outside, those contradictions are almost impossible to interpret correctly in real time. The public, removed from the intimate details, often believes it could have seen more clearly, acted sooner, done better. But families living inside such situations rarely have the luxury of certainty. Every decision is made with incomplete information, under pressure, guided by hope as much as fear. One of the most striking aspects of this story is how often people describe the final period as normal. That word appeared again and again in recollections. Normal dinners, normal conversations, normal routines. Normalcy, in this context, became a double-edged sword. It offered relief to those who had lived through years of instability, but it also dulled the sense of urgency that might have prompted different action. Yet expecting families to remain in a constant state of alarm is unrealistic. Human beings are not designed to live indefinitely at crisis intensity. Eventually, vigilance gives way to exhaustion. That exhaustion does not mean indifference. It means limits have been reached. This is where public judgment often becomes most unfair. Observers ask why more was not done, without fully reckoning with how much had already been done or how little room for maneuver remained. The resurfaced videos amplified this tension. They invited viewers to believe that meaning was hidden in plain sight, waiting to be decoded. But footage is a fragment, not a full map. A flat expression on camera does not reveal what happened an hour earlier or what thoughts followed afterward. Silence can signal danger, but can also signal fatigue, medication effects, or a momentary withdrawal that passes. The problem is not that people watch the videos. It is that they wanted the videos to resolve the story. They wanted evidence that could turn ambiguity into certainty. When that certainty failed to appear, fear filled the gap. Another layer of reflection emerged around how society talks about mental illness after violence occurs. There is a fine line between understanding and reduction. On one side lies stigma, the dangerous idea that diagnosis equals inevitability. On the other lies denial, the refusal to acknowledge how profoundly illness can alter perception and behavior. The Reiner story sat uncomfortably between these extremes. Reports of schizophrenia and medication changes offer context, but they did not explain everything. Nor should they. Reducing a human life to a diagnosis strips away complexity and agency, while ignoring illness altogether erases reality. What remains is an uneasy middle ground, where responsibility, compassion, and limitation coexist without neat resolution. For many viewers, this ambiguity was the most disturbing part of all. It meant there was no clear takeaway that could guarantee safety in the future. No checklist of behaviors that, if noticed, would always prevent disaster. No simple reassurance that love, vigilance, or resources would be enough next time. Instead, the story left behind a quieter, more demanding lesson. That care is not a transaction, and outcomes are not proof of effort. You can love deeply and still lose. You can intervene repeatedly and still fall short. You can do everything that seems reasonable and still face irreversible consequences. Accepting this does not mean giving up on prevention or support. It means approaching them with humility rather than illusion. It means understanding that some warning signs are visible only in hindsight, and some battles are not winnable in the ways we expect. As the videos faded from constant circulation, many people carried this discomfort with them. They thought about friends who had grown quieter, about relatives who answered questions with politeness instead of emotion, about moments they had brushed aside because nothing seemed immediately wrong. Not all of those memories point to danger, but the story changed how they were held. Silence began to feel less neutral. Calm felt less definitive. The haunting power of this case, then, does not come from fear alone. It comes from recognition of fragility. It forces a reckoning with the limits of control and the necessity of presence, even when presence cannot guarantee rescue. Part Sao is where the narrative stops asking what happened and starts asking how people live with the knowledge that sometimes, despite effort, attention, and love, outcomes remain beyond reach. That knowledge is uncomfortable, but it may also be the most honest ground on which understanding can stand. Part B closes not with answers, but with the space those answers never filled. After months of coverage, analysis, and quiet reflection, the story of Nick Reiner and his parents settles into something less like a case and more like a lingering echo. What remains is not a single image or quote, but a feeling, the sense that something important was happening in plain sight and yet remained unnamed until it was too late. The 7 haunting videos that once circulated endlessly no longer shock in the same way. Instead, they sit like fragments of an unfinished conversation, reminders of how easily suffering can blend into everyday life when it does not announce itself with noise or spectacle. The internet eventually moved on, as it always does, but many viewers carried the unease with them. They did not remember the clips because they were graphic or sensational. They remembered them because they were ordinary. A calm walk down a quiet street, a flat answer to a personal question, a polite exchange at a gas station. Moments that, on their own, would never raise alarms. Only when stitched together after the fact did they form a pattern that felt unmistakable. That retrospective clarity is both powerful and dangerous. It tempts people to believe that next time they will know, that next time the signs will be obvious. But the truth this story leaves behind is more fragile than that. Sometimes there is no dramatic signal. Sometimes the line between stability and surrender is so thin it can only be seen from the other side. For families living through long struggles, this reality is especially painful. They are often asked, implicitly or explicitly, to explain outcomes they could not control. The Reiner story revealed how heavy that burden can be. Love was present, effort was constant, hope persisted, and yet the ending was catastrophic. Accepting that this can happen does not diminish the value of care. It clarifies its limits. It reminds us that support is not a guarantee, but a commitment made without certainty of success. In the aftermath, conversations about mental health grew louder, but also more nuanced. Some people spoke about the danger of romanticizing suffering or interpreting quietness as strength. Others emphasized the need to take emotional withdrawal seriously, even when it comes wrapped in politeness and routine. Yet most acknowledged a harder truth, that awareness does not always translate into prevention. Sometimes it only deepens compassion after the fact. The haunting nature of these videos lies in how they shift responsibility away from a single act and toward a shared vulnerability. They force a reconsideration of how society defines warning signs, how it responds to those who are not visibly disruptive, and how it supports families caught in cycles of hope and fear. They also challenge the expectation that every tragedy must yield a lesson that can be neatly applied. Some stories do not teach how to fix things. They teach how to sit with uncertainty and loss without forcing meaning where none exists. For viewers, the lasting impact is subtle. It appears in moments of hesitation before dismissing someone's quiet withdrawal as nothing. It appears in conversations that linger a little longer, in questions asked a second time, in a greater willingness to tolerate discomfort rather than rush toward reassurance. These are small shifts, but they matter. They acknowledge that silence is not empty, and that calm is not always safety. As time passes, the details of the case will fade, replaced by newer stories and louder controversies. But the emotional imprint remains, not as fear, but as attentiveness. The recognition that human beings can carry immense pain without outward signs, and that the absence of chaos does not mean the absence of struggle. In this sense, the story's legacy is not the horror of what happened, but the humility it demands. It asks people to look closer, listen longer, and accept that even then, outcomes are not fully within anyone's control. The final question it leaves is not who failed, but how society chooses to respond to the quiet, complicated realities of mental illness and emotional collapse. Whether it continues to chase dramatic warnings or learns to take stillness seriously, whether it seeks certainty or accepts that some truths arrive only in fragments. Part B ends where it began, in that uneasy space between knowing and not knowing, where the most important work is not solving the story, but carrying its weight with care and letting it inform how we see others before hindsight turns their silence into a warning we wish we had heard sooner.